Dr. John Maass is joining us today to talk about his new book, From Trenton to Yorktown, The Turning Points of the Revolutionary War. In this masterful yet accessible narrative of America's fight for independence, Dr. Maass identifies the 5 decisive events that secured independence for the 13 hard-pressed but determined colonies. These include not only the victories at Trenton, Princeton, and Yorktown, but the leadership and necessary reforms that ensured Washington's forces were capable of enduring the harsh conditions of the winter of 1778 and the remainder of the war. It also, Dr. Maass's narrative explores King Louis's decision to supply the Continental troops during the Saratoga Campaign with soldiers, arms, money, and more resources as a key factor in winning that battle and turning the tide of the war. These turning points, not all of them triumphs on the battlefield, delivered a victory for the new United States. By challenging conventional interpretations of what ensures victory in warfare, From Trenton to Yorktown offers a fresh perspective on the Revolutionary War. Now, a little bit about our wonderful speaker, Dr. John Maass, who's given me permission to refer to him as John through the program. We always check these things here at the Capitol Historical Society. John is from Rockbridge County, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. He received a Bachelor of Arts in History from Washington and Lee University, a Master of Arts in U.S. History from UNC Greensboro, and a PhD in Early American History from the Ohio State University, which will make at least one of my colleagues very excited and another of my colleagues a little perturbed, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. He is a historian at the National Museum of the U.S. Army at Fort Belvoir here in the D.C. area, and he's also a veteran of the 80th Division of the U.S. Army Reserve. So, John, thank you for your ongoing history work, for your service, and for sharing what you've studied and learned about the turning points of the Revolutionary War here with us today. Please take it away.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the U.S. Capitol Historical Association for having me and contacting me about this. I'm glad to be here and to share some time before the July 4th weekend with folks interested in the Revolutionary War. And so I really appreciate that. I guess maybe I'll start with kind of how I got going on this project. I have written some other Revolutionary War books that would best be described as monographs, which is what academics used to call a book that's about a single subject. So one on the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, one on the prelude to Yorktown, another on George Washington's Virginia. And but I wanted to do a more interpretive look at the Revolutionary War and the key moments of the war. It went on for 8 years, a lot of ups and downs, as most of you know, and probably more downs than ups if you really look at the whole scale of things. If you charted it out, kind of the high points and low points. So I decided to look what were really the key turning points of the Revolutionary War. And there are a lot of them, but I only focused on 5. So I'd like to start with explaining why I picked the 5 as we go along, but also my definition of a turning point. I think when folks know about kind of the framework that I'm using, it's easier to understand my interpretation of this. So I'm going to read my definition from my book. Don't be alarmed. I'm only going to read one sentence for the book. The rest will be just me talking. But let me just read to you the working definition that I have of a turning point, and that is turning points refer to battles, campaigns, sieges, and other military events that are decisive and result in significant change that alters the trajectory of the conflict toward the war's outcome. And the key part of that is, to simplify it a little bit further, is altering the trajectory. So there were many events, many famous events: Bunker Hill, Lexington and Concord, the Siege of Charleston in 1780, Kings Mountain in Cowpens in South Carolina, And those were all important moments in the war. They affected how the war went from 1775 to 1783. But again, getting back to my definition is how which events altered the trajectory of the war toward victory, toward the eventual American victory. And maybe another way to put it is to kind of reverse engineer that and say which events without which there would not have been an American victory. That's another way to look at it. So as Samuel mentioned, the five turning points that I suggest and write about that did, beyond all others, alter the trajectory of the war was Washington's victories at Trenton and Princeton at the end of 1776 and Princeton early 77, the Saratoga Campaign in 1777 in what we call now upstate New York, uh, part of uh, part of Canada, the winter encampment at Valley Forge, which lasted 6 months from December of 76 to June of 77, the Carolinas campaign of 1780, 1781, and particularly the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina, and of course, the culminating campaign that involved the Americans and their allies, the French, against the British in the Yorktown campaign of 1781. So let's take them briefly. And in the time we have, I have five turning points. So we don't have that much time for each one, but I'll summarize them and get right to the point on why I think it's a turning point. Um, let's start with in order, the Trenton Princeton campaign. So by the end of 1776, George Washington, in command of the Continental Army, had been defeated several times in the New York City area at Long Island in the summer of 1776, Kips Bay, White Plains, the surrender of Fort Washington on Manhattan Island, and he had been driven all the way across northern New Jersey, basically from the Fort Lee position in New Jersey, opposite Fort Washington on the Hudson, to the Delaware River at Trenton, and wound up being able to cross the river ahead of the British and escape. But his army had shrunk from about 20,000 troops in August of 76 to about 2,500 troops in December. And at least half of those troops, their enlistments were going to expire at the end of 1776. So Washington, on the west bank of the Delaware River, opposite Trenton, a little bit north of there, but for all intents and purposes, Trenton, he knew that he had reached the point of desperation. His army was going to be cut in half. The British, once the Delaware froze over, would be able to cross it and attack him. Congress was evacuating Philadelphia. He had to act, and so his writings and the writings of others are clear on this. That this was the moment. This was the low moment of the war, and despite some other recent books that have come out over the past several years that point to other low moments before this as the lowest. I completely disagree with that, and I think most other serious students of the war do, to show that Washington was desperate and he had to do something. He had to buck up the spirit of the people. He had to win some kind of victory to help recruiting, to recruit the re-recruiting of the army there at the end of the year. So he put together a bold plan to cross the Delaware River on Christmas Day that night and attack an isolated garrison of Hessian troops, which were German hired troops that were hired by the crown, the king, and of Great Britain, and to attack it with the force he had in a surprise attack, which he managed to do. Um, Now, south of Washington's Crossing, two other elements were also planned to cross the river, and they were unable to do so because of the terrible weather, the ice in the river. But Washington's troops were able to get across the Delaware River. Everybody's seen the famous paintings, including their artillery, and they were able to almost surround, but definitely defeat the garrison at Trenton, which consisted of about 1,200 Hessian troops. After capturing most of them, Washington's army retreated, crossed the Delaware River and back into Pennsylvania. But some of the other columns that he originally wanted to cross on the same day that he did, particularly one closer to Bristol, Pennsylvania, they were able to get across the river. And so Washington decided and cajoled a large number of his men into extending their enlistments for another week or so and cross the river again. So they occupied Trenton. The British tried to attack them. Washington slipped away after successfully defending the attacks south of Trenton on Assunpink Creek, and moved in a daring night march and attacked another isolated garrison of British troops at Princeton, which he also was able to defeat. So these three victories, the two at Princeton, the two at Trenton, and the victory at Princeton, were exactly what he needed and exactly what the American cause needed. All of a sudden, the American cause seemed to have life in it. People from New Jersey, citizens of New Jersey, started to rally behind the American cause, whereas just weeks beforehand they were signing loyalty oaths to the British. Recruiting was increased. Militia started to turn out. And this gave the Americans a tremendous shot in the arm when they most needed it. Because without these, Washington's army would have been down quickly to less than 1,000 troops. And the British had 10 times that number, 20 times that number in the New York, New Jersey area. So a tremendous boost right there, which came into 1777. Now, having done that, the British were able to pull in their troops from northern New Jersey and focus on New York City, and this leads us into the 1777 Saratoga Campaign. Now, this campaign was planned very poorly, and it's one of the best examples in U.S. military history of what not to do. In fact, in British military history as well. Remember that the planning, a lot of the planning was at the behest of the British minister, Lord George Germain, who was in London. And he was trying to coordinate two British armies, one based out of New York City under Sir William Howe, and another based in Canada, which was under the command of Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. So rather than focus their troops and concentrate their troops in one area, the British decided to have the army from Canada advance southward toward New York, and the New York forces move up along the Hudson to try to cut off New England from the rest of the American colonies. And the plan as you can imagine, was extremely difficult to coordinate because the communication between Burgoyne's army coming down from the St. Lawrence River and Howe's army operating in New York was very difficult. The messages had to come around by sea. Messages from London took 6 weeks to arrive on a good voyage. Howe also decided to concentrate on Philadelphia at the same time, which completely diluted the efforts. So the campaign, as most of you know, ended with Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga in north of Albany, New York, between Lake George and Albany, New York, and the surrender of about 8,000 troops, dozens and dozens of artillery pieces that were much needed by the American forces, and a complete victory for the American commander, Major General Horatio Gates. Now, why is this a turning point? Two reasons. Number one, obviously, the Americans were able to eliminate a major British field army and put about 8,000 troops or so into captivity, completely eliminated those troops from the chessboard, so to speak. But the more important result was that it led directly to a treaty of alliance with France. And the French and the Americans, the envoys in Paris and Versailles, Benjamin Franklin, Silas Deane, they signed a treaty of amity and commerce, which was basically a friendship of support and commercial relations, but also a military alliance where France decided that they would make overt which had been covert for a year or so, and provide the Americans with more arms and gunpowder, artillery, ammunition, clothing, food supplies, and everything else that the Americans needed as well. This instantly brought a huge boon to American fortunes to have this alliance. And the greatest benefit from this new alliance with France is that America had now that which it did not have and never would have during this war, which is a navy. The French Navy added a totally new dimension to the war, and in that way, they were able to counter the British ability with their Navy to move troops all up and down the eastern seaboard, bring supplies over and reinforcements over from the UK. Just an instant game changer. And also, I'm certainly not the first person to point this out, but as I make plain in my chapter on Saratoga, is that the focus of the French and the British, once this situation occurred where there was a war between Britain and France, immediately refocused the war geographically away from the American colonies to the West Indies, the Caribbean. The islands in the Caribbean were eminently valuable to both of those countries for their sugar production. That's where a lot of business was, commercial interests. And so both France and Britain focused and concentrated their chief efforts in the West Indies. And that meant withdrawing troops from what's now the United States. We'll just refer to that as America. Withdrawing troops and a concentration, and particularly the navies, down to the Caribbean. So there were from the early 1777, the treaty was signed in February. From that point on, there were not going to be any large scale reinforcements coming to America after that. The main focus was the West Indies, and thousands of British troops were sent from New York to the West Indies for the rest of the war. So big turning point right there. Now, my third turning point is Valley Forge, and most folks are familiar with that. Um, this is not a battle, of course, although Valley Forge was a military encampment. Um, the Americans, after the British captured Philadelphia in September 1777, defeated Washington at Brandywine, Pennsylvania, and Germantown, just north of Philly. Washington eventually retired and took up a position close enough to Philadelphia to keep an eye on the British, but also far enough away where he would have ample warning if the British were advancing against Valley Forge. So that was about 20, 22 miles away. And the American army entered Valley Forge encampment December 18th, 1777, and marched out June 18th of 1778. Now, why was Valley Forge important? Why was it a turning point? Well, there were two reasons. First is probably the most commonly known is the training and reorganization and of the Continental Army. Most folks know about Baron von Steuben arriving in the camps in early 1778 and training the American troops, simplifying the drill for citizen soldiers who were not used to it, shaping up the camps, uh, instilling among the officers of the army this knowledge of hygiene and sanitation and drill and discipline and any number of other soldier tasks in those ways. And he was very successful. Um, it's and when we say drill, I'm not just talking about how to load your musket and fire it. The Baron taught the officers who taught their subordinates who drilled the men how to move on the battlefield and to the battlefield like a professional army. So just think to yourselves, if you have an armed column of troops on the road approaching the enemy, how do you get your men from being in a column on a road to deploy into a line of battle, 2 or 3 ranks deep, ready to fire, fix bayonets, charge, move to the left, move to the right? How does one do that without it becoming a gaggle? Anybody who's been in the military knows that you've got to be able to do that. Even people who have been in marching band in high school or college know that you've got to be able to give commands that the troops understand and can do that. And that's what von Steuben gave to the American army. And that became very obvious at the first major battle after the Valley Forge encampment, which was Monmouth Courthouse in late June 1778, where the proficiency of American troops was on full display at that battle. But another key turning point that occurred after Valley Forge or during Valley Forge had to do with George Washington and the command of the army. Even before the encampment at Valley Forge, Washington and some of his closest supporters in the army and in Congress were convinced that there was a faction within Congress and several Army officers who were opposed to him retaining command of the Continental Army and wanted to remove him. And when you think of the timeline here, by the time that Washington's army entered Valley Forge, General Gates had already won the Battle of Saratoga. He had won the greatest American victory in the war so far. Washington's last real victory was Princeton in January of 1777. That was 11 months ago. So there were some congressmen who did not think Washington should keep the command, and also some of his officers, uh, not really his within his encampment, but hanging around Congress and with other stations, other assignments. Most notably, the two names most notable are Thomas Mifflin and Horatio Gates, the victor of Saratoga. There was also the supply problems, and there were supplies in Pennsylvania. There was food, there was clothing, there was medicine, but the problem was how to get it to the camps. There were weather problems, lack of transportation, muddy roads, rain, snow. The British were buying supplies with actual silver and gold. The Americans were trying to buy supplies with very worthless continental currency that farmers didn't want to accept. So Washington solved these two problems by an ingenious way of getting the support of, of Congress, which is he invited a committee of congressmen to visit the camp at Valley Forge. Now, Congress at that time was meeting off to the west in York, Pennsylvania. So Washington invited Congress to create a subcommittee and visit the camps so that they could see for themselves what the problems were and that he wasn't exaggerating. Um, academic book on Valley Forge came out several years ago, accuses Washington of overstating and exaggerating the problems at Valley Forge to get Congress's attention. Well, that particular academic was not at Valley Forge, but Washington was, and Congress was as well in this committee, and they came to the camp and instantly understood that Washington was serious and that something needed to be done. And one of the great methods that Washington used with this committee was by the time they arrived in the encampment in late January of 1778, he had a 16,000 word document explaining everything that was wrong and how to fix it. In other words, he controlled the narrative. And the congressmen and the committee were very effective in dispelling those myths about Valley Forge and trying to get to the bottom of the problem. Now, they didn't fix it all the way. The army had more bad winters ahead, more supply problems, particularly at Morristown, New Jersey, and especially with the American credit. But at least for the Valley Forge period, this gave the army kind of a footing that they could use to fight for the rest of the war. Washington was also able to rid his enemies in Congress and the two generals in what was known as the Conway Cabal. That is this group, claimed a group of officers and congressmen who were opposed to Washington, and he was able, with his representations to the committee and also some key maneuvering, to get rid of that. Washington became the commander of the army. His role was undisputed, after Valley Forge, and particularly after the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, which the American troops did very well at, and basically sealed his control of the Continental Army and the American cause for the rest of the war. Washington's commission, when he was first commissioned in 1775, it states on the commission that he was commissioned as a commander, and he was commissioned general, the rank of general, and commander of the Continental Army. Up to the point of Valley Forge and the subsequent Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, Washington was a general, but it was clear after Valley Forge that he was the commander in chief. Now, let's talk about the South. Um, many years ago, through the bicentennial and into the bicentennial period, books about the Revolution were primarily focused on the Northern Campaign. So Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill, New York, Trenton and Princeton, Valley Forge, Saratoga. And then the books would have one chapter at the end of the book that covered everything that happened in the South in one chapter and finish at Yorktown. Well, the South was far more important than that. And the war was won in the South at Yorktown, which we'll talk about in a minute. But in the Carolinas, in particular, Carolinas and Georgia, the campaigns, mostly beginning in late 1778 through 1783, were vitally important to the American cause. And my chapter on the South focuses on what I consider the most important campaign, which was that of the Carolinas from the spring of 1780 to the spring of 1781. Now, I'll go through the timeline very quickly here. In May of 1780, the American garrison at Charleston, South Carolina, surrendered to a large British force in May of 1780, May 12th. Those troops, there were thousands of Continentals and militia troops that were captured there. After the surrender, a large part of the British Army returned to New York City under the commander-in-chief, Sir Henry Clinton. A portion of the troops were left in Charleston under Lieutenant General Charles Lord Cornwallis, several thousand troops there. And his mission was to basically conquer and pacify and occupy and restore the royal government to South Carolina. So he fanned out various garrisons in Georgetown, 96, Augusta, Camden, the Shiraz, to occupy South Carolina. He defeated an American army at the Battle of Camden in August of 1780. That army was dispersed and fled into North Carolina. So at that point, South Carolina was largely under the control of the British. But Cornwallis decided that in order to better secure South Carolina, he would also move into North Carolina. So after the Battle of Camden, Cornwallis and his small army moved north toward Charlotte, North Carolina, in what's called the back country. In early October of 1780, British loyalists, meaning those people in the backcountry loyal to the king, were in arms and were defeated by American backcountry and over the mountain militia at the Battle of Kings Mountain. Now, that wiped out the entire 1,500 men loyalists. Cornwallis lost all of those men at the Battle of Kings Mountain. Now, what did he do after that loss? Well, he withdrew about 40 miles from Charlotte back into South Carolina, regrouped. Many of his men were ill with fevers, and he was reinforced from troops from the Chesapeake by way of Charleston, such that in January he began advancing again into North Carolina. 1,000 men under one of his subordinates, Lieutenant Colonel Bannister Tarleton, were defeated in mid-January at the Battle of Cowpens, and almost all of them were wiped out. What did Cornwallis do? He kept advancing and advanced into North Carolina. He crossed the Catawba River in a small battle at Cowan's Ford, and kept advancing. And he even chased the American force under Nathaniel Greene out of North Carolina in a movement that went from what's now Salisbury and Salem, North Carolina, into Virginia. So in March, as Cornwallis was maneuvering around central North Carolina, General Greene collected enough troops to be able to meet the British at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which is basically within the city limits of modern Greensboro, North Carolina. The British won the battle, but their losses were so heavy, about 28%, that Cornwallis decided to withdraw from central North Carolina because of a lack of supplies and a need for reinforcements, and marched all the way to the coast at at Wilmington, North Carolina. And after about 2 weeks there, he decided, well, in order to prevent supplies and troops from reaching Nathaniel Greene's army, he needed to destroy the logistics operations in Virginia. So by early May, he had left North Carolina and had moved to Virginia. Now, let's go back and quickly look at each of those battles and what their result was. The Battle of Camden, British victory. Cornwallis moves north toward Charlotte, North Carolina. Battle of Kings Mountain, American victory, but it only slowed down temporarily Cornwallis's advance to North Carolina. Cornwallis keeps advancing toward Charlotte. Battle of Cowpens, January 1781. What was the result? British defeat. What did Cornwallis do? He advanced into North Carolina. Battle of Guilford Courthouse, British victory. What did Cornwallis do? He retreated to Wilmington. So of all those battles in 1780 and 1781, which one was the most decisive and resulted in Cornwallis leaving South Carolina, leaving North Carolina, and moving into Virginia? Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which is why that is my fourth turning point. Finally, probably the most obvious to folks, I think, is Yorktown. Cornwallis had moved into Virginia, as I mentioned, and by August of 1781, was looking for a port to bring his army to that could be protected by and also help support Royal Navy ships operating along the southern coast of America and the West Indies. So eventually Cornwallis gets down to Yorktown and ensconces himself there as a riverside port with inside the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Now, Yorktown is really the largest scale operation of the entire war as far as geography. It really ranges from the French fleet leaving France, going to the West Indies, coming into the Chesapeake, the British coming from North Carolina, and additional troops from New York City, and a combined French American army concentrating from Rhode Island and north of New York and moving all the way to Tidewater, Virginia. Very, very wide scale operation. With the French fleet defeating the British at the Battle of the Capes off of the mouth of the Chesapeake, September 5th, 1781, the French gained control of the access to Yorktown. Cornwallis is trapped. The Washington brings his troops and leads the French under Rochambeau. There's a siege of Yorktown, and Cornwallis surrenders. So, why is Yorktown one of the turning points of the war? This was finally this defeat of the British, again, much like Saratoga, eliminated for the second time in the war a major field force, again 7,500 to 8,000 troops out of the war now. Then the British simply did not have reinforcements by this time to defeat the Americans. There were no more troops coming over. They needed all the troops they had to be engaged in the West Indies and also the siege of Gibraltar, which in the Mediterranean. So no more troops were going to be coming. The British Parliament had had enough. Taxes were high to pay for this. It was becoming enormously expensive. And so this was really the final turning point that convinced a majority of British members of Parliament that that was it. King George III did not want to give up, but his ministers and his chief allies in Parliament realized that was it. The war went on on the books really until 1783. There were some more actions, but for the most part, Yorktown was the last major operation in the Revolutionary War, and that's the final of my turning points. So a lot of folks have their favorite battles that they like to talk about and read about, and that's great. I do too, particularly in the South. But getting back to my definition of which turning points change the trajectory toward victory, that's the 5 turning points that I have, which I suggest in my book were the most crucial. So with that, I'll leave some time here for questions. And hopefully, if you have any questions, you'll please put them in the Q&A, and Sammy will get to them here in a second.
Well, John, thank you so much. This has been really fascinating to hear you talk through these turning points. And as folks start to send in their questions, I'll sort of, pitch you a broader one, which is, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of American independence. Earlier this year, we marked 250th anniversary of the Continental Army. And there's a lot of discussion of public memory. And I wonder if you could, perhaps it's waxing philosophic a little bit, but I wonder if you could talk about how these turning points have been viewed through history, and if there's been any sort of shift in the way these turning points are remembered.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the biggest shift over time has been the importance of the Southern theater. For a long time, you had what was commonly jokingly referred to as the New England Mafia, which were historians and museum folks. And this goes back to the mid 19th century. They were writing about the war that was near and dear to them in New England and the Mid Atlantic. There was a large George Washington fan base, so to speak. And Washington, other than Yorktown, Washington didn't fight in any of the battles in the South. He wasn't involved in those operations personally. And so New England could claim him not as one of their own, but certainly as their hero and their savior. And that lasted for quite a long time. Southern academics, Southern researchers, writers, historians tended to focus more on what was near and important to them, which was the U.S. Civil War. Now, these are broad. I'm talking broad brush strokes here, but in general. But the historiography has really changed quite a bit to focus a lot more on the South. There's still, unfortunately, books that come out. One recently, I can't remember the title, something like "This Fierce People" or something like that, and still call it the untold story of the South. H.W. Brands also talked about the untold story of the Civil War, America's first Civil War. Um, there's plenty of material out there in the last 30 years. Um, really, maybe the biggest splash being John Buchanan's The Road to Guilford Courthouse in 97, I want to say, 96, 97. Um, uh, and, one of the surprising situations is when for a long time Americans really didn't understand France's role in the war, and the story of Yorktown was largely Washington and the Continentals, with a little help from the French Navy winning the campaign, and it wasn't always emphasized how crucial the French role was in the Yorktown campaign. And you could argue that within that wide ranging battle, the most important event involved no American forces or officers whatsoever, which was the Battle of the Capes. That the French naval victory off the coast of Virginia, that did not allow the British to control the entrance to the Chesapeake and put a cork in the bottle for Cornwallis. That's after that the British were really cooked. Um, but I'd say how we look at it, in my opinion, is mostly the French in the
Sure.
South. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a compelling answer, and I think that that speaks to some of this public memory that
Mhm.
is so much of what we do, so much of what you do with your museum. I want to we've got an interesting question, sort of a nuts and bolts question, if you will, from one of our listeners, which poses the question: Howe deliberately ignore orders from London to connect with Burgoyne, or did they arrive too late after he had left Philadelphia? If you know that from from your research. I know that's a little bit of a deep cut there, but
Well, let's look at it from the 30,000 foot perspective, and it's a good question. When one of there's been two very good studies of Saratoga recently. One by Kevin Weddle, the other by Eric Schnitzer. And when people say which one book to read about Saratoga, I say there is no one book. You have to read both of them because they're both very, very interesting in their own ways, and excellent books. But when you really boil it down, Howe didn't have orders from London to join Burgoyne along the Hudson. It was Howe that was trying to develop a plan to in late 1776, and he sent back to London to Germain several plans that kept evolving. Sometimes 3 days after a letter went out to London from New York, he had a new plan. Now, interestingly, one of the things that made Howe change his plans was when the news of Trenton and Princeton arrived. And all of a sudden, Howe had to uh, contract his garrisons out in New Jersey. And once he found out that this 1,000 man garrison was gone, Washington and the American spirits and morale had increased, and people were starting to join again. by the mid-January, he wrote back to Germain and said, "Oh, by the way, we're not going to be able to end this war in 1777. Just hope you know that. And by the way, I need 15,000 more troops," which he did not get. But how was Howe decided early on, for some reason, that he was not going to make cooperating with Burgoyne his primary objective. And initially, he thought that he would be able to have time to, while Burgoyne was coming south from the St. Lawrence River toward Albany, that he would have time to take a by boat an expedition up the Delaware River and capture Philadelphia. And once that was done, he'd send some of those troops along the Hudson to march northward to operate along the Hudson. Now, Burgoyne and Howe and Germain, when you get down to the nuts and bolts of their correspondence, the British forces from New York were supposed to operate along the Hudson in support of Burgoyne. There were no orders that said General Howe and some of his troops from New York will link up with Burgoyne at Albany. That was never mentioned. Now, what happened was that Howe was delayed in leaving New York. Ill winds prevented the army from leaving New York for 3 weeks. He didn't leave until July, and they got to the Delaware and decided this isn't going to work. Let's go around by way of the Chesapeake Bay and land at the head of the bay in what's now Elkton, Maryland, near Wilmington, Delaware. Long delays, just a catastrophe. And if you read, you can read my chapter, but also Weddell's and Schnitzer's books, and we all point out that once Burgoyne realized that he wasn't going to get support from Howe, and that the American army in front of him, first under Schuyler, then Gates, was growing bigger and bigger and bigger, he started to panic and started to cover his butt with correspondence, because no one wants to be left holding the bag, and that's basically what happened. And if much like the Battle of the Capes being the most important engagement of the Yorktown campaign, and Guilford being the most important engagement of the Carolinas campaign, really the most important engagement of the Saratoga campaign was the Battle of Bennington. And that was really Burgoyne's last chance to gather more supplies before the final push to Albany. And it was an American victory, and that was it. That was it.
It's these moments that are, it's so close and so tightly contested. And I think one of the things I really appreciate about your book and about your work here is that you're highlighting and reminding us that, it's easy to focus on the big flashy, the names that are in bold, marquee font. But it takes all of those pieces fitting together. It takes those, coin flip kind of moments to make history history. If you'll indulge one more sort of big question before we wrap
Sure.
things up here in a couple of minutes, to that idea, and again, one of the things I really appreciate about your book is that it's sometimes easy to focus on battlefield exploits, on the heroic, warfighter, charging into battle and leading a martial exploit to victory. But you take time to explore some of the non-battlefield moments that contributed to the ultimate success of the American Revolution, to logistics and politics and diplomacy. Can you, again, perhaps wax philosophic for a moment, but talk about why it's so vital that we appreciate those elements of the Revolutionary War, especially as we, approach this semi-quincentennial?
Well, I think I would start by saying that, and there was an old expression. It seems like every old military expression is attributed to Napoleon. I'm not sure if this one is or not, um, but the battle. The quote is something like, battles are decided by the quartermasters in advance," and I think the Americans figured that out. Trial and error. Um, Washington appointed Nathaniel Greene as quartermaster in March, I believe, at Valley Forge. I think it was in March of 1778. Greene didn't want to do it. He famously said that no one in history has ever heard of a quartermaster, right? Uh, uh, but they really figured it out there for a few years, and really what almost ruined the American cause was the credit, was the money situation. Um, uh, but there had to be that apparatus, and again, it goes back to the French alliance. The French knew Rochambeau, de Grasse, a lot of the French generals and admirals in American waters. They sent back word, "Hey, they are broke, and we need to fix that and assist in that way, because they've just run out of steam." And in fact, when the French fleet from France, in Brest, left France and picked up 3,000 French troops in Santo Domingo, what they also brought with them from Santo Domingo was cash, and they knew that they had to do that, not only to buy their own supplies, but also to pay American troops. So there was a lot. That's just a few in the few minutes we have. That's just a few examples of how uh, there was a lot going on that had to be done in any army, in any army, in any war.
Absolutely. Well, John, it's been such a delight talking
Thank
with
you.
you, hearing you recount these turning points of the Revolutionary War. And I certainly am going to cherish this conversation as we head into Independence Day tomorrow and as we head into the semi-quincentennial year. This is what we always call a little bit of our NPR moment, where we talk about upcoming events. So if you'll indulge everyone on the call here, I'm going to pull up the next program on our docket is Eisenhower's message from the fighting front, his address to Congress in 1945. We're glad to be joined for that by Dr. Todd Arrington, the director of the Dwight Eisenhower Presidential Library. That's going to be towards the end of this month on July 24th. A reminder, we always record these programs. I know someone sent a message in earlier. We record these, we publish them to our YouTube channel and to our website. So you can come back and you can share them with your friends. You'll get a link to the YouTube as a follow-up after it's uploaded, probably early next week with the holiday. But we are only able to do this sort of work to support the telling of American history and the telling of capital history in our way, thanks to the support of our donors and members. We are chartered by the Congress, but we are not funded by the Congress. And so this is a chance for us to say thank you, to encourage you to tell your friends about our work, to share our mission to foster and increase an informed patriotism. And so as we head into this Independence Day holiday, as we head into that semi-quincentennial observance, America 250, we look forward to continuing to bring stories from American history to you and for you, and to do our part to mark a quarter millennium of our great experiment in democracy. John, thank you for being here once again. Thank you for your history work,
Thank you.
service, and we wish you all a pleasant holiday. Be well.